Tom, welcome to the program.
Hello.
Now, what are Israel's primary security objectives at this stage of the operation?
Well, Israel has the same objective it's really had from the start, which is to secure the release of all its hostages, some of which have now been there for a year and a half, and to remove Hamas as the governing party in Gaza, or to disarm Hamas. And those remain the objectives throughout. They haven't changed. Israel obviously has had a certain degree of military success. It's also recovered quite a number of its hostages, but Hamas remain active, and they still have about 59 hostages that they seized on October 7th, 2023, so quite a long time ago now, and about half those hostages are believed to be alive.
Okay, and how does Israel assess the ongoing threat posed by Hamas, particularly in light of recent events there?
Well, Hamas is greatly weakened, but it's still a fighting force. I mean, they built up over a 20-year period, having seized control of Gaza in 2006 or 2005, so a 19-year period, they've built up a substantial arsenal. And even though a year and a half of conflict seems like a long time, it took, for example, the British and Americans longer to recover the Iraqi city of Mosul from ISIS. And ISIS had only spent 2 or 3 years entrenching themselves in Mosul. Hamas have spent 2 decades entrenching themselves in Gaza. So even though Israel did kill the head of Hamas in Gaza, Sinwar, a few months ago, and Israel has killed a lot of Hamas fighters, nevertheless, a great many remain, and they still are pretty well armed.
Okay. Could you outline Israel's perspective on the current restrictions around Gaza, especially concerning humanitarian concerns?
Well, Israel argues that in the previous stages of the conflict, when a lot of aid was going in, this actually strengthened Hamas. Hamas seized the aid, and then they used it as a method to assert even greater control over the Gazan population. Hamas would distribute food and other aid according to who it liked, and it would squash Palestinian opposition within Gaza by using the aid. So Israel argues that under the laws of war, it's entitled to control the amount of aid that goes in order to stop Hamas using it for military and other purposes in asserting greater control over the population there. Opponents would say no, Israel is under an obligation to make sure that all Palestinians are well fed and looked after and have proper health and humanitarian supplies. Israel says that in fact they supplied so much in the first year and a half of the war, there is plenty there already. And Israel also dismisses claims by some international agencies that there is something like a starvation approaching or hunger, pointing out that throughout this conflict, people in the international community who may be prejudiced against Israel have repeatedly said there's the brink of starvation, but in fact, there hasn't been any starvation, and this is incorrect alarmism aimed at pressuring Israel and aimed at allowing Hamas to reassert control.
So this is known information that Hamas was actually withholding aid and basic necessities for the Palestinians that were in need inside the enclave?
Yeah, more than that, they shot dead. We know there are lots of films of it, and there has been reports here and there, including on Arabic language stations, of Palestinians who are not associated with Hamas trying to get aid, and Hamas withheld it for their own use or to distribute as they saw fit. And a number of Palestinians were shot dead by Hamas at various stages in the conflict for wanting food and stuff if those Palestinians politically were not supportive of Hamas.
And how's Israel working to maintain crucial international alliances while pursuing its security goals?
Well, Actually, Israel has quite a lot of support among governments, more than one might think from sort of public protest or media protests. So let's start with the Arab world. In recent days, Jordan has outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, Hamas is the Palestinian branch, the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. Jordan has outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood. They were already outlawed in Egypt. Saudi Arabia has also moved closer to Israel's position. And interestingly, the new government in Syria, which itself has Islamist origins or is Islamist, a few days ago they arrested two very senior Palestinian officials based in Damascus. So in the Arab world, I think there's an increasing tiredness with Hamas clinging on to power. We also, by the way, see the Palestinian Authority President, Mahmoud Abbas, used some very strong language against Hamas a few days ago, calling them sons of dogs and other worse language, which I won't repeat here. So I'm not saying that the Arab governments support Israel, but they have a shared concern with Israel as to not want Hamas to come out victorious from this war. When it comes to Western countries, the United States, the Trump administration is probably more supportive of Israel than the Biden administration, the previous American government until January was. And with a few exceptions, most European governments, although they don't want to see any suffering, of course, of Palestinians, they also want the war to finish, Hamas removed from power, so that a rebuilding stage can begin. There are some governments in Europe that are particularly critical of Israel, like Spain, Ireland, Norway, and Iceland, but they seem to be in a minority at this point.
Okay, I want to hone in on what you said about US support, with the Trump administration having more support for Israel than the Biden administration. Where does that stand as we speak? Because we do know that when Trump was first appointed for his second term as the President of the United States, he did say that he had an idea about bringing out all the Palestinians from the enclave and then re-establishing it as the Riviera, if I remember correctly. What's happened since then in terms of US support for Israel in the Palestinian cause?
Well, nothing's happened vis-a-vis his Riviera idea, which I'm not sure that even Trump meant it. Sometimes Trump says things which, he's just putting it out there to shock. And I'm not, he said it about other things like annexing Canada or grabbing Greenland. And maybe in his fantasies, he'd like these things to come about, but I'm not sure how serious he is. But in actual support for Israel, Biden was withholding certain military equipment, and the Trump administration's no longer withholding that. Also, America's taken quite firm action against the Houthis, the militia in Yemen, which is aligned with Hamas in Gaza, and both of them are supported by the Islamic government in Iran. The United States has been carrying out airstrikes quite firmly against the Houthis. And politically, I think the Trump administration is less critical on an international stage than some of the Biden administration was. Towards Israel, less critical towards Israel.
And what is Israel's response to concerns raised about proportionality in its military actions?
Well, Israel says that this whole concept of proportionality is a kind of media buzzword. What would proportionality really mean in reality? It would mean going and kidnapping Palestinian children and raping women, which is what Hamas did in October 2023. The laws of war, as I understand them, are not based on some kind of tit-for-tat one-on-one. What Israel argues is that it is trying to target Hamas and only Hamas, even though when Hamas embeds itself in civilian infrastructure and, say, is firing rockets from that infrastructure and Israel hits at those rockets, then civilians may also be harmed, but under the laws of war, Israel has the right to hit back at a rocket launching unit of Hamas. Whereas Israel would argue that Hamas when it was firing rockets, was not aiming at military targets. On the contrary, they were aiming at civilian targets. So in terms of proportionality, there is no war on which proportionality comes into play. This is a kind of media concoction around this particular conflict. We don't hear this word used very much in other conflicts. It's not about sort of tit for tat. It's about you're allowed to target armed combatants and you're not allowed to target civilians. And those are the rules of war.
Okay, and how does Israel view the recent ceasefire proposals being discussed through international mediation?
Well, both sides, Israel and Hamas, have put forward ceasefire proposals, and they are at odds with each other because the fundamental sticking block is whether Hamas will remain armed and remain as a governing force in Gaza. So all the ceasefire proposals by Hamas would allow Hamas to remain an armed group that would effectively run Gaza, and all the ceasefire proposals that Israel wants would like to see Hamas disarmed and possibly go into exile or become a regular political party, no longer an armed militia. So this is the main sticking block, in fact, and it's impossible to reconcile. Either Hamas will remain the armed group in charge of Gaza or it won't. And again, I should point out that even the Palestinian Authority want Hamas to give up power in Gaza. That's the West Bank-based leadership under Abbas, who incidentally just appointed for the first time in 20 years a successor a few days ago. So President Abbas, the Palestinian president, who also wants Hamas out, and he's 89 years old, for the first time he has appointed a sort of deputy who would be poised to be his successor should he have to stand down.
So Hamas doesn't look like it will be willing to give up power anytime soon, despite these mediated ceasefire efforts. Where do you see the conflict going? Will it continue at this intensity?
That's why Israel is continuing to hit Hamas fairly hard. I mean, Israel would argue that the only way Hamas will give up power is a mixture of military diplomacy and also giving them an exit strategy. It has been offered to the remaining Hamas leadership to go into exile. I believe in Algeria or Sudan are the two locations that would agree to take them. Algeria, behind the scenes, has agreed to take the Hamas leadership and some of the senior fighters from Hamas. And, so far Hamas haven't budged, but, eventually people give up if they feel the war is over. So as yet, Hamas don't feel beaten. But they may well do so at some point in the near future.
And what's Israel's approach to the ongoing hearings at the International Court of Justice?
So again, Israel doesn't regard these as properly legitimate. And in fact, the foreign minister of Israel, Gideon Saar, this morning used some pretty forceful language against the International Court of Justice. He called it a circus. He called it a shameful proceeding, what's going on. He said it's not Israel that should be on trial, but UNRWA, the UN agency, which is sort of aligned with Hamas, according to Israel. He said UNRWA should be on trial, not Israel. He pointed out that about 1,400, according to Israel, of UNRWA staff are aligned with Hamas, and a number of them actually participated in murder and kidnapping. They also pointed out that some of the hostages released under the previous ceasefire, such as the British citizen Emily Damari, said she was held in an UNRWA facility by armed Hamas fighters or terrorists aligned with UNRWA. So Israel says the International Court is prejudiced against it, and it should be putting Hamas and its supporters on trial, and not Israel. So Israel has dismissed the court.
Okay, so as dismissive as Israel may be, we know that there's also a lot of backlash and reaction from inside of Israel by the Israelis themselves. We've seen massive protests taking place because they want an end to what's going on, because it's inflicting their lives as well. And we know that they've expressed their discontent with Netanyahu. What's the situation like there?
Yes, so there quite a lot of opposition to the Israeli government and to the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, but there's a slight misunderstanding abroad. This opposition is more about tactics. It's about prioritizing the release of the hostages, even if Hamas would stay in power for the time being. Nobody denies the right of Israel to take defensive measures within Israel, but there are political opponents to Netanyahu who think he's been in power too long, want him to resign, although in fact there'll be elections about a year or next a year and a half from now. They'll be by the end of next year, so they will have a chance to oust Netanyahu democratically next year. But these protests are more against Netanyahu for some domestic reasons, and also for not prioritizing, as they see it, the release of the remaining Israeli hostages. They're not protests against the conduct of the war, apart from by a very small number of people.
Okay, again, from Israel's standpoint, what key elements would be necessary for a lasting peace arrangement?
Well, there is a minority in Israel that may not want peace. They may want to keep all the territory, to indeed annex territory in Gaza and the West Bank. But this is a small minority. Most Israelis, as far as I can tell, and from polls, want peaceful relations with the Palestinians on the other side of the border. But they want a government there that also wants peace, a government that will put its efforts into building up Palestinian economy and Palestinian culture for the benefit of its people, not a party like Hamas, which is more interested in, what they call armed resistance, or its partners, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, whereas as their name implies, they're interested in jihad, i.e. an armed struggle. They want a government that will govern. And I think most Palestinians probably want a Palestinian government that will prioritize the welfare and needs of the Palestinian population and not spend billions and billions of international aid money building up, plans to once again attack Israel with rockets and other methods.
How would you describe public sentiment within Israel regarding the government's handling of this conflict?
Well, the government's divided, and as I said, some people want, the hostages out. But in general, I think there's support. For example, one thing Israel's done is it successfully greatly diminished the power of Hezbollah in Lebanon, because remember, there were rockets coming over from Lebanon all over northern and central Israel day after day, and those rockets have stopped after Israel defied the Biden administration and took very forceful action against Hezbollah. And I might point out, one thing that people are often surprised by is a lot of Lebanese, and indeed Syrians and even Iraqis, are supportive of Israel having taken strong action against these Iranian proxy militias, Hezbollah and other Iranian militias in Syria and Iraq, because they too don't want to be under the control of these Iranian militias. So if you speak to people maybe more quietly, there's actually quite a lot of support within Iraq, Syria and Lebanon for Israeli actions. And even in Egypt, there's also support for battering Hamas. That doesn't mean anybody's happy when any civilians are displaced or died, but that there is support for Israel pushing back against these Iranian proxy militias, notably Islamic Jihad, Hamas and Hezbollah.
Okay, Tom, my last question to you. How important are regional actors like Qatar and Egypt in shaping the future course of dialogue?
Well, Qatar and Egypt are sort of intermediaries with the ceasefire negotiations. I'm not sure how much trust there is in Qatar, because Qatar, they maintain relations with all kinds of actors, even with the Taliban and ISIS, and also with Hamas. They house Hamas. So they may be used as intermediaries for ceasefire negotiations, but I'm not sure that Israel trusts the government of Qatar for future, too much influence over Gaza. I think Israel would prefer Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, maybe Turkey, to be involved in future rebuilding and governance and overseeing Gaza, but less so Qatar, which is one of the sort of governments that created this problem with Hamas in the first place.
Tom, thank you so much for joining us on the program. We appreciate your contribution.